All right, yeah, I'll go ahead and get us all started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, License to Leave, your playbook for life after VMware. I'm Kimberly Glowacki, and I'm the Director of Strategic Growth at IP Consulting, and I'm going to be your host today. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes, and we're expecting this session to run about 60 minutes with questions and answers at the end. So Stephen is working behind the scenes to collect questions, so please do feel free to drop those into the chat at any time, and we'll tackle as many as we can when we get to the end. I'd also like to take a moment to address a last-minute change. When we were promoting this webinar, we had mentioned that Alex Boyce would be part of the session. Alex is one of the technical architects behind our migration strategy, and he helped shape the technical foundation for today's content, but he's not able to join us live. But his expertise is certainly built into the material that we're going to be covering. Now, today's discussion will be led by Sherry Mosey. Sherry is our President and Chief Operating Officer. Sherry works closely with clients as they navigate those complex technology decisions where cost and risk and operations and timing, they all matter. So this session is designed to be practical and accessible and not overly technical. So Sherry is the right person to help connect the business decisions to the technology path that we want moving forward. We also have joining us our CEO and founder, Milton Moore. Joining us, and he's going to be sharing a bit about IP consulting and who we are as an organization. Milton has been guiding technology leaders for over 20 years, and he's passionate about delivering real solutions for real organizations. Sherry, Milton, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kimberly. I'm very glad to be here. And this topic matters because a lot of organizations are feeling real pressure right now. And VMware has been a trusted part of so many environments for so many years that the hesitation around making a change is completely understandable. As a project and operations leader, I look at this through a practical lens, asking questions like, what is the risk? What does the timeline look like? What will this do to the team? What does leadership need to understand? And how do we make a decision without creating chaos? So that's the lens I'll bring today. My goal is not to convince everyone to migrate. My goal is to help you decide and understand what your options are clearly enough so that it can make sense for your organization.
Thank you, Sherry. We look forward to the education. So, Milton, before we get into deep to the content, it sounds like you're on the hook to tell everyone a little bit about IP consulting, who we are, what we do, and why you think we're uniquely positioned to guide organizations through such an important decision.
Thanks, Kimberly. For anyone that's new to IP Consulting, we're a managed service provider and IT consulting firm with deep technical roots in IT infrastructure. For more than 20 years, we've helped organizations make practical decisions around infrastructure, cloud, cybersecurity, and support. As you can see, we have a strong track record. Our role isn't to push one platform. It's to help you make the right call for your environment, whether that's staying put for now, migrating, or going hybrid. So what do we do? IP Consulting supports organizations across a full infrastructure lifecycle, managed support, virtualization migration, cloud strategy, and infrastructure modernization. Today's VMware conversation touches all four. A hypervisor decision is never just a hypervisor decision. It connects to backup, storage, hardware lifecycle, and ongoing support. Kimberly and Sherry, I'll hand it to you to walk through how to evaluate the path forward.
I love that framing, Milton. Thank you so much for that. I think, some of the things I've heard you say, it's not always about, it's about the best decision and not the fast decision. So I hope that people are hearing kind of that methodical approach that you've instilled in all of us. So, all right, Sherry, I'm going to switch it over to you to have you take us through the agenda of what we are planning to cover today.
Thank you both. So first, we want to make sure that we establish a basic understanding about what a hypervisor is, because once that concept clicks, the migration conversation becomes hopefully a less intimidating. Then we'll walk through what's changed with VMware after the Broadcom acquisition. That brings probably several people here today, reevaluating their options. From there, we'll compare the major paths forward. We'll focus on Proxmox, Hyper-V, cloud, and situations where, frankly, VMware might still be the right call. Then we'll talk about what migration actually looks like, including some risks that people worry about the most. Those would be, primarily downtime, backups, compatibility, vendor support, and overall team readiness. And then lastly, we'll share some real client examples. We'll close with some practical next steps and some Q&A time.
All right, that feels like a solid agenda, Sherry. So before we get into the licensing changes and alternatives that you were talking about, I want to pause here for just a moment because I know we have people on this webinar with different levels of technical background. So Sherry, can you explain in plain language a little bit about what a hypervisor actually is and why switching one is maybe not as scary as it might sound?
Absolutely. Yes, great foundation to start from. So if we think about the environment in layers, at the bottom, we have our physical servers. That's that hardware that you can touch and that your organization currently owns. On top of that is where the hypervisor sits. That's the software layer that allows one physical server to run multiple virtual machines. VMware is one example of a hypervisor, but it's not the only one. Above that, you have your virtual machines, and you can think of those as the actual servers where your applications live. And at the top, you have your applications, SQL, Exchange, ERP, file servers, et cetera. Those are what you interface with on a daily basis. But the key takeaway here is in a hypervisor migration, we're primarily changing just one platform layer underneath the virtual machines. We don't have to rebuild all of the applications from scratch. So maybe a simpler way to think about it is we're moving boxes from one storage unit to another. The storage unit changes, but the boxes are still the boxes. It doesn't mean that migration's effortless, but it does still require planning and validation and rollback and things we'll get to soon. But it does. It also means that this is a known and manageable process. It doesn't require a full rebuild and starting over. So just remembering that only one layer is changing hopefully makes the change a little bit less scary.
Absolutely, Sherry. Thank you for that primer of giving us just a general understanding. I'm hearing this. So my applications, they sit on those virtual machines. Those virtual machines then actually ride on that hypervisor platform, and that hypervisor platform really is running on the Blinky box, the hardware of it all. And so it's just one piece of that that we're talking about changing or migrating. And so everything else, for the most part, situationally driven would stay the same.
You got it.
All right, all right. Now that we've laid some of that groundwork, Sherry, I'd like to dig into, a little bit of how do we get here? Why is this such a hot topic right now?
Well, VMware was the default choice for many organizations. It's mature, familiar, and very widely supported. However, when Broadcom acquired VMware, the licensing model changed very quickly. And the major shift was the move from perpetual licenses to subscription only. And that matters because organizations that previously were used to buying and owning those licenses suddenly had to rethink virtualization as an actual recurring subscription expense. At the same time, VMware customers started seeing more bundling, overall less flexibility, and minimum purchase requirements. So the cumulative effect was a greater impact on those small and mid-sized environments, and that makes it not just a price increase conversation. It's really a change in the way that organizations have to budget, plan, and negotiate for a critical infrastructure layer. And that's, why so many organizations are facing not just what will VMware cost, but they're having to ask, does VMware still fit in the way we operate? And as we go to the next slide, we'll highlight why does this matter for customers? We just explained what changed, but why do those changes matter? And it's not just that costs went up, it's that now you have less flexibility, less predictability, and less leverage. And that makes budget planning harder and renewals are less predictable. We talked about bundling changes, and that means you're maybe paying for a suite when you only need a core virtualization feature. And that's, those minimum purchase requirements can hit smaller environments especially hard because now the floor is higher than what you actually need. The support paths have changed as Broadcom restructures the partner environment as well. And so you have fewer even support models. So again, that question is less about do we like VMware and more about is this the right infrastructure strategy still serving our business needs? And then that again, that's why making understanding what those options are matters because virtualization is now a business planning decision, not just a technical platform decision.
And I think it sounds like these changes are quite significant, especially for those small and medium-sized businesses. But do you feel like this is a widespread concern that you're seeing or hearing?
Yeah, it definitely is widespread and across the industry, not just one vertical. The numbers on this slide are less important individually than what they tell us collectively. It's that organizations across the market are reevaluating their virtualization strategy. And to be clear, these are not IP consulting numbers. These are cited from authoritative and reliably conservative sources. So some of the real numbers are actually greater. Um, Small and mid-sized organizations, this concern is especially real because they don't have the same leverage that that larger organizations have, like those enterprise agreements with a dedicated VMware team and sometimes even less budget flexibility. So again, the takeaway is not everybody must leave VMware. The takeaway is we should understand our options before the renewal pressure starts to take some of those options away.
And I think you bring up some really good points here. And we hear so much across the industry about those upfront cost increases. But what are some of the other cost shares that people should be considering, even when we're talking about staying with VMware?
For sure, yes. The renewal invoice is the obvious thing, but the other costs tend to actually build over time. We talked about the unpredictable pricing, those renewals that come in with less negotiation leverage, so that budget planning is almost impossible. The deepening lock-in every year that you stay with VMware, dependencies can grow and your exit path becomes harder. Um, Again, that forced bundling, if your organization only needs core virtualization, but you're having to pay for a larger suite, that's not operational value. And then, fourth, the shrinking support that we mentioned, because Broadcom is consolidating around its largest enterprise accounts, those smaller and mid-market organizations are feeling that squeeze. And so when there's a problem with the environment, needing to figure out who can even support you, you might not have those same resources available that you were able to rely on. So when we talk about the hidden cost of staying, we're not saying staying's always wrong. We're just saying that staying without understanding the full cost and the risk picture is where the decision needs to be focused as well, because inaction can feel safe, but it's still a decision.
I think this is definitely a good depiction of what those compounding costs can look like. But can you show us an example of what that might look like?
Yep, absolutely. We developed some illustrative ranges. Every environment's different, and your actual cost will depend on things like core count, host count, licensing terms, support requirements, et cetera. But for a typical 30 virtual machine environment, we're seeing VMware licensing land in the range of about $18,000 to $25,000 per year. Alternative platforms can often come in significantly lower, sometimes in the $3,000 to $5,000 range for both licensing and support. So the point is not that every organization will match these exact numbers. The point is that the pricing model is fundamentally different. With VMware, many organizations are now dealing with that subscription-only pricing, bundling, minimums, et cetera. But with the alternative, the model can be more flexible and more closely aligned to what the organization actually uses. And that's where that 50 to 80% licensing reduction can come from. It's that right sizing. As a project and operations leader, I also look at the other side of the equation. Migration has a cost. There's planning, scheduling, validation, communication, change management, and I don't want anybody to see this slide and hear this and think that migration's free, but in many cases, the migration becomes then a one-time investment, whereas staying with an escalating licensing model is that recurring cost, and that's why that analysis matters.
And I think, we're seeing if I just look at it from the rearview mirror, the last couple of years and the increases that we've seen and the changes over the VMware licensing. And, I know you don't have a crystal ball for what it's going to look like next quarter or next year for renewals.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I would have bought NVIDIA stock or sooner. But when it comes to operational budget, I think we'd all like to see the future, especially when it comes to cost.
Costing, that would be very nice. Well, let's talk about options then. So I think this is where a lot of leaders can get stuck because they hear all these different platform names, but they don't always know what those names mean in practical terms. Sherry, can you take really kind of dig into walking us through those major paths in plain language?
Absolutely. And again, I'm emphasizing up front, the right platform is the one that fits your workloads, your team, your budget, and your long-term operational plan. But just to unpack some of the leaders here, we generally guide clients through one of three primary paths. We see Proxmox, Hyper-V, and Cloud. There's other alternatives on the market for sure, and we can absolutely advise on fit there. But these are the platforms where we see most often practical value from the organizations that we serve. So I'll start with Proxmox. That is often the strongest option when your primary drivers are cost control, flexibility, and that unnecessary licensing, bundling, and complexity. Because it's open source, it means that the license model is very different than VMware. You don't have to, deal with that subscription structure. And it's especially attractive environments where we've got a Linux workload, a mixed operating environment, or where we have teams that are currently comfortable with the open source platform models. A few highlights from an operational perspective. Proxmox gives, many of those core capabilities that we would see in VMware, like clustering, high availability, live migration, snapshots, storage integration, and centralized management. So in summary, Proxmox's primary differentiator is effective control. You get flexibility and capability without paying for that bundling overhead. Moving into the Hyper-V, that's oftentimes the lowest friction option for organizations who are already deeply invested in Microsoft. So if your team is already managing a Windows Server, Active Directory, 365, Azure, et cetera, Hyper-V might feel more familiar operationally. The biggest differentiator with Hyper-V is that it's the ecosystem alignment. For many organizations, that platform's already part of the licensing and technical environment that they're using every day. So this can reduce the training burden and make the transition feel less disruptive. And Hyper-V can be especially attractive for smaller environments with only one or two hosts, or where organizations like a Windows Server workload already dominates. The trade-off here is that for more complex clustered environments, a shared storage design, management tooling, and some long-term architecture needs need to be planned carefully. It can be a great fit, but it still needs to be designed, not just turned on. Another area that we want to talk through is the cloud migration. So that can be, it's a different conversation, and we'll unpack that in a moment, but moving to the cloud is not just replacing VMware with another hypervisor, it's a broader decision about where your workloads should live. It can be a strong fit when the goal is to reduce your physical server footprint. You're moving applications to SaaS, where perhaps you need some the ability to support remote access, improve scalability, or you're looking at avoiding another hardware refresh. Cloud is not automatically cheaper though, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions we have to face, is that because the cloud costs fluctuate with usage, usage stemming from things like data transfer, egress, and egress fees. That can be a big surprise to some people. And also some workloads just don't perform well in the cloud because of things like latency, file supply, file size, or the overall application architecture. So we tend to say that the real question isn't should we move to cloud? It's more, why and what's the use case? I would say cloud's main differentiator is its flexibility and the footprint reduction. It can definitely help reduce the on-prem infrastructure, but it needs its financial and workload discipline. And then I mentioned earlier a little bit about other alternatives like Nutanix or other all-in-one infrastructure platforms. Those can be excellent options, especially in larger enterprise environments or organizations that are already planning a broader infrastructure modernization project. But for many of our small and mid-sized organizations, those all-in-one platforms are oftentimes more than what they actually need from both a cost and complexity standpoint. So, just looking at things like reducing the complexity overall with a simpler virtualization platform that we pair with shared storage and a strong backup might be the right sized infrastructure. So again, the real decision isn't just which platform is best, it's which platform is best for the way your organization actually operates.
Wow, that was a lot. Sherry, thank you so much for unpacking all of that. Really appreciate it. And I know that you had mentioned here a little bit earlier about the options of moving to the cloud. Would you mind digging in a little deeper into that?
Yes, yes. Hypervisor migration, thinking back to the prior slide, it means that we want to keep those workloads on premise and often the same or similar hardware. But when we change, and that involves, changing that virtualization layer from VMware to something like Proxmox or Hyper-V. That path can give you more predictable costs and keep your infrastructure under control and, reuse the investment you have in your existing servers and storage if that still makes sense. But cloud migration is different. That means your applications are going to move into infrastructure owned by a cloud provider like Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. And that can be very valuable, but it definitely changes the cost model, also changes the support model, the security model, and sometimes even the user experience overall. So on-premise tends to give you more control and predictability, but cloud will give you more flexibility and scalability. So again, neither is automatically better. They solve different problems. We just see that the best approach is to decide workload by workload.
I think that's fair, and I don't want to pigeonhole you into. I know it's workload by workload, but when does cloud, generally, when does it make the most sense?
Yes. So again, we always want to look back at the business goals. So one of the best cloud strategies is to start looking at the applications, not the servers. So we think about maybe you're running a file server still on premise, and does SharePoint fit that need? Can we migrate that to a different cloud platform? If email is still on premise, can we move that to 365? We look at applications like QuickBooks is a great example. You can install that locally, but it has a strong SaaS option, and maybe you don't need to host that server at all anymore. So it's different from lifting every virtual machine into the cloud and hoping the bill works out. The cloud makes sense when your organization wants to reduce your physical infrastructure, you support your distributed teams and avoid investing in another round of hardware. But again, you need to know your workload limits. Several latency sensitive applications, such as CAD, that's a common one, some legacy databases, and actually certain vendor appliances just don't perform well and may actually become more expensive in the cloud. And so hybrid is actually often the right answer. So we'll keep local what needs to stay local and move what makes sense and replace what no longer needs to be a server at all.
Okay, I think that's fair. That makes sense. I know it's still kind of, it depends, but I think that gives a little bit more clarity around that. So let's get back to talking about the real costs and even some trade-offs. I want people to go into this with their eyes wide open. So what would a migration actually involve?
Yes, I appreciate that question because we always want to be really direct. Migration is not free. It's definitely not something you should treat casually. There's a planning effort, and we have to start with discovering the environment. We map out the workloads, we understand the dependencies, and we build a schedule that fits the organization. And then there's training. Your team needs to understand the new platform because before it becomes the primary environment. Um, there's things like temporary coexistence. So because for a period of time, you may have VMware and the new platform running side by side. So that drives compatibility validation. Um, every application, backup tool, vendor appliance integration, we need to check all of those things. And then there's change management. People need to understand what's happening, when it's happening, and who owns which steps. So yes, migration has a real cost. But then the other side is staying also has a cost. So we talked about that a little bit. If your VMware renewal is increasing every year and that cost repeats, you're paying for bundled products you don't use, and your leverage is decreasing every renewal cycle. So while migration is usually that one-time investment, staying in an escalating model becomes an ongoing operating expense. And our goal is to answer which cost gives more control over the next 3 to 5 years.
Thank you for that transparency on the kind of the real costs of the migration. And I think that for some folks, it maybe it's not no, it's just not right now. So I know that there's times that make sense to stay. Can you help us dig into that a little more?
100%. Yes, VMware is not evil by any means. It's just getting more expensive. So the real situations where staying on VMware, at least in the short term, would be maybe you have an existing enterprise agreement or subscription that still offers favorable terms. Maybe you've got some NSX or vSAN dependencies that need careful planning to unwind. You don't want to solve a licensing problem by creating an operational one. Um, if you have some specialized vendor appliances that are certified only for VMware, that has to be validated before we move. Perhaps your hardware is approaching some end of life in the next 12 to 18 months, and we want to make some, maximize the value there. So defer for a little while. Or perhaps you already have a data center move or a cloud transition planned, and so adding a hypervisor change on top of that might create unnecessary complexity. So in those cases, we often tell clients to just, use the remaining contract term and then plan strategically, but get the assessment done now so that we at least have some negotiation leverage when your renewal comes.
Well, I think you make some really good points. I know that it's really difficult as you were kind of preparing for this because no situation is exactly the same. There's always something unique about every environment and every situation. So I think, once someone understands, what their options are, what's a good way for them to be looking at which is the path that actually fits for them?
Yes. I'm a huge advocate for starting with the end in mind, right? So what is the organization's situation, not just the platform? A few questions that we ask are, so if your primary driver is reducing your costs and avoiding bundles, then Proxmox is usually the strongest candidate and give you those virtualization capabilities without that licensing model overhead. If you're already a Microsoft heavy organization, Hyper-V is the most natural fit. Your team likely understands the ecosystem and the transition might feel less disruptive. If your goal is to reduce the number of servers you own and manage, then cloud or SaaS replacement becomes the right conversation to start having. And that's especially true if your existing applications are already cloud ready. Smaller environments with only one or two standalone Windows hosts, Hyper-V can be very practical. You don't need a more complex architecture. But for environments with 3 or more hosts, maybe you've got some shared storage, some clustering, high availability needs. That's when we come back to Proxmox, and it can become compelling because it's designed to support those those operational requirements in a cost-effective way. So again, please don't make a decision based on a slide or a single, a single sit down. This slide is intended to give directional guidance and some, high level consideration points, but the actual recommendation comes from looking at the environment itself. We look at your workloads, the dependency, the storage, the backup, the license, your skills, compliance, and your overall timeline goals. And that's all of the things that we do in our assessment. So a recommendation is not based on just what platform's trendy. It's based on what your team can operate confidently and what your organization can sustain long term.
I think you make a really good point there is what's sustainable long term. And, we know that, one of the things is minimizing risk, especially for those folks who sit in the IT leadership roles or in some of the operational leadership roles as risk mitigation. And I know that that's a little bit passionate for you. So I'd like to ask you to jump into that a little bit.
Passion for a project manager? Absolutely. What can go wrong? Yes, every migration has risk, and we can't pretend otherwise. But the difference between a risky migration and a controlled migration, we like to camp on 4 pillars. So planning, validation, rollback, and communication. But focusing first on concerns, we address data loss, and that's the fear that most people mention first. Our approach for that risk is pretty straightforward. We don't delete anything from the source environment until the destination's been validated and signed off. We use snapshots and backup and that rollback planning so that there's a defined safety net. A second concern we hear frequently is production downtime. This we mitigate by moving in phases. We start with some of those lower risk workloads and schedule the production moves during approved maintenance windows. And then we are able to validate each stage before we move forward. Another common concern is the team readiness. So your team might not know Proxmox or Hyper-V on day one, and that's completely normal. And that's why we include documentation, knowledge transfer, and ongoing overall support. A fourth concern we hear frequently is compatibility. Some applications, those vendor appliances, backup tools might have specific platform requirements. And here's where we don't guess. We make sure that we review those dependencies before we migrate and design around them. And then finally, I'll say again that rollback plan. If something doesn't behave the way we expect, we need a path back. And here's where we make sure we define the plan back before we move anything forward. So the risks are real, but they're manageable, and don't want them to become reasons to avoid a migration. They're reasons to just execute with some discipline.
And I think that is the power of having that, that well thought through planning strategy. So thank you for that. The planning, the validation, the rollback, and the communication. I think those are kind of pillars to any good project going well, especially one that's got, this much visibility on it. So I want to kind of change things up a little bit. I think it's fair to assume that not everyone who's on the webinar with us today is on the same stage of this journey. So I think that the next question is going to be, we kind of dug into the different hypervisors and where they fit, but what's going to work for my environment?
I think a key question is, will my applications still work? And let me go backwards. Yes. But I want to answer that carefully. In most cases, your applications don't know or care what hypervisor is sitting underneath them. Your applications live in that virtual machine. And so when the virtual machine moves, the applications, the data, the operating system, and the configuration moves with it. And that's why we say that the application travels with the virtual machine. But Murphy, and we don't rely on theory alone. So before we migrate anything, we make sure we review the environment, we identify all those critical applications, we map out those dependencies, and we validate whether anything has a special requirement, those business critical things. And that includes your backup tools, your vendor appliances, your integrations, your database, your line of business applications. So Again, that short answer is yes, the applications continue to work after migration, but the reason we say that with such confidence is because we validate before the cutover. And that's the important distinction. We don't migrate first and hope it works. We verify first, then move.
Yeah, I think that sure that could be its own slide. I don't have a slide for that, but I think it's really appropriate to mention it again, that it's not just that leap of faith. I mean, really, we know that there's corner cases out there where workloads or applications just might not be the right fit for every hypervisor. And so I think this is where that clear path process that you were kind of talking through really earns its keep. So, before we move over a single workload, we're doing that confirmation of the compatibility on the targeted platform before that cutover ever happens. So if something needs a rollback, obviously there's a plan for that.
Absolutely, yes. I wish we would have built you a slide. But you mentioned our clear path, and yes, that approach matters. Again, it's assess, plan, validate, transition, support. The validation step, I think, is what most well can be the temptation to skip, but that's what really protects the organization from surprises.
Agreed, for sure. So for those who, again, different stages of the journey, might be ready to move, what could that process look like for them?
Yeah, the proven process that we've talked about, that phased approach, because most organizations can't afford a just disruption. Again, using that 30 virtual machine environment example that we started with, we typically see a 3 to 6 week timeline, depending on the complexity, scheduling, and overall how quickly the organization can support the validation. Um, Always the first step is, again, that discovery and planning. Here's where we inventory the environment, we map out those workloads, we identify the dependencies, review those backups in the recovery plan, and that's where we select the target platform, make the decision. Are we going to stay what hypervisor, and are we going to move to the cloud or a hybrid? Then we move into overall scheduling, and here's where the project management matters the most. We make sure we're working around your maintenance windows, your department needs, your critical applications and internal staffing, and that schedule has to fit real operations, not just the technical convenience. And then we'll conduct the migration in phases. We usually start with those non-critical workloads first, and that lets us validate our process, get comfortable with the data integrity, and just build some confidence before we have to move those production critical systems. And then again, equally important, after the migration, we have that validation checkpoint again. We're working with your team to confirm that everything's running properly and that users can access what they need. And then again, we continue on with that ongoing support, because the migration's not really successful just because the final VM moved. It's successful when the environment's stable and your team is confident operating it. So we're going to work at your pace, but I'll stress that the timeline isn't about just moving the servers. It's moving carefully enough that the organization stays operational, and a good migration shouldn't feel heroic. If it feels heroic, something probably went wrong in planning.
We're not building opportunities to build heroes, because that means something bad probably happened. So I love that take that it's not going to be heroic. So I know you've seen this happen in the real world, and I was hoping that you might take us through some of the examples that you think might be helpful.
I love this opportunity. So we'll start with a client story that was built around a municipality. They came to us with some aging infrastructure, and their VMware had some rapidly escalating subscription costs. And we worked with them over a couple budget cycles, actually. So we evaluated their current environment and their exposure, their long-term goals, and we migrated their hypervisor environment over. Once we actually had everything in place, we were able to migrate the hypervisor environment over 2 weekends, and that was 19 virtual machines overall. That resulted in an 80% cost reduction for them. And then we were able to accomplish that with 0 hours of unplanned downtime. I love their words. They said IPC laid out our options and handled the migration over 2 weekends, and we didn't skip a beat. Another example was a law firm client. And in this case, the timing was critical. They were in the middle of an ERP migration, and the last thing they needed was another disruptive infrastructure project. However, they got their VMware renewal bill or quote, excuse me, and they said we can't do this. And so they called us and said, what can we do? What are our options? And we selected Proxmox because it gave them the right mix of cost control, virtualization capability, and operational simplicity. That migration was completed in 4 weeks, including the design and the planning. They achieved a 65% savings and had 0 hours of unplanned downtime. And what I really like about this example is it shows that migration does not have to become a massive distraction. With the right planning, it can support the broader modernization roadmap instead of competing with it.
And I think Sherry, this one I know really well. So, in to kind of put a star on the end of that, and you talk about the modernization roadmap. Some of the things we didn't do these last year because it wasn't timing. There was hardware concerns, and so when you talk about the 65%, and I know that that falls short of some of the numbers that you were showing earlier in this presentation, but that 65% included changeovers to new hardware and the costs that were associated with that, but it didn't include things like other subscriptions that they were able to get rid of because of this consolidation. And I say this because I think it's important. We put these technologies in place and they've served our business well, but they're kind of a set it and forget it. And when's the last time we went through and said, hey, is this still serving our business? And so I think that was a big piece that happened with that law firm. And then the zero planned downtime. Especially when you're doing a big ERP migration, they could not afford any downtime. So I think that is really impactful, and people worry about that first, when they hear about the migration. So thank you for those powerful proof points. And I want to talk about, timing and what's the right timing to get started.
Well, I like to say, when's the best time to plant a tree? 10 years ago and today. So, seriously, the honest answer is you should start earlier than you probably think. Often we use your renewal timeline to determine how many options you really have. While we were able to accomplish, something in a handful of weeks, that's not our preferred path for anyone, right? So we ideally we'd like to start 12 or more months out. That's our ideal window. And then that time frame, we can assess your environment and compare your options and plan thoughtfully so that we're migrating on your timeline. If there's a growing constraint in the marketplace for new compute hardware, and that makes it more important to plan early if a purchase is part of an ideal plan. If we're in that 6 to 12 month window, we still have time, but the process needs to be more intentional here. That's where that phase plan matters. We might still be able to build out a new environment and validate the workflows and move in waves before that renewal pressure comes in. If we're under 6 months, the conversation becomes urgent. That means we don't panic, but and also please don't sign a renewal without knowing what your alternatives are. Even if you decide not to migrate, a completed assessment still gives leverage to make sure that you're, going to renew with the best plan and the best subscription. It also gives you real data about your environment, your cost exposure, and your options. So please don't wait until you get your VMware renewal notice to start evaluating your options, because then you're already operating under some pressure.
Yeah, and I think, Sherry, the fact that we're having this webinar and people have attended, I think says that there's a lot of folks are really already kind of pointing their toes in the right direction. But I want to kind of think back to, I know that it becomes a lot more critical when they're inside of that 12-month window for renewal. But I mean, I think even if you're 24 months out, the time to look is now. And that goes back to some of the things I think you've really kind of hit hard on, which is the planning. So the making sure that you have the right partnerships in place or you have the right understanding. You've got time to train your team and it doesn't feel like it's trial by fire. And you can really kind of make sure that you're wedging that into all the other priorities that you have as an IT organization and as a business that, there's critical times of business. And I think you've said it, we don't want to go in during tax time and help an accounting service do something. That's the wrong timing for it. So just the planning, just getting out ahead of it, I think, whether you're 12 months is when I think it starts to get critical, but anytime before that, like let's at least take a look at it.
For
So,
sure.
and I know that you've got some numbers here for the people in the room of what they can actually expect. Can you share that with us?
Yep, for sure. Um, the biggest savings typically is realized from your licensing, that subscription component. Many organizations, when we're moving to the right size alternatives, see the reduction in that 70 to 85% range. And I would say a typical payback period is often under 12 months, but I do want to be precise. That doesn't mean that every migration reduces every cost by 85%, because we just noted migration itself has some project costs, and there might be some hardware, some support, some backup, some training considerations that need to be included in the ROI computation. But the value comes from replacing that escalating recurring license model with a more predictable structure. So we recommend looking at a 3 to 5 year total cost, not just that 1 year invoice. That helps us avoid some of those surprise renewals. And our perspective isn't just evaluating the right platform on money alone. It's we want to support where can an organization regain the control over their infrastructure roadmap?
I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier is really doubling down on, is this serving us? It did serve our business needs, but what's the future going to bring, especially as we start thinking about like, the integration of AI and, all these different things are going to be changing our technical landscape. So no, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I know, Sherry, that you've talked a lot. And then when we came into this, you'd said to me, Kimberly, I want to make sure we're educating. We're out there educating, folks, because we think this is such an important topic. But, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it. I know you peppered it in there, but the value that IP consulting brings to the table. So I want to give you an opportunity to share the why.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. I think it comes down to how we approach change. One of the things, and Milton shared this earlier, we're client first. That means that our recommendation is based on our clients' needs, not on pushing one platform over another. And we're also full service. We don't just hand over a report and say good luck. We assess, design, migrate, train, support the environment after the transition. And we have that proven migration methodology. The zero unplanned downtime result we talk about isn't just a marketing slogan. It comes from phased execution, the rollback planning, the validation, our clear path methodology in order to keep the process structured. Again, that assess, plan, validate, transition, and support. So, the value of IPC is not just that we can move workloads, that's a dime a dozen. It's that we help organizations make the right decision, execute it carefully, and then support them afterward.
I love that. That's awesome. So, all right, before we get to the live Q&A, I want to run through just some common questions that we hear, and I know that you pulled those together. So I want to get started with, how do you decide? Do you stay? Do you migrate? Do you go hybrid?
I want to just say, a lot of organizations often start with what platform should we choose? If we're moving off VMware, what are our options? And I really want to encourage a different first question, and that would be, what are we trying to solve? What are the primary goals? Are we trying to reduce licensing costs? Are we trying to simplify our operation? Are we trying to improve our backup and recovery? Maybe we're trying to prepare for the cloud. Maybe we just want to get some leverage before our renewal comes up. And that's why we need to understand, what is the organization actually paying for? What workloads need to stay local? What are the dependencies that could complicate the migration? What are some existing infrastructure that can be reused? And then, of course, who will support the environment after the cutover? So those are the questions that separate a rushed migration from a good infrastructure decision. And please just don't start or focus only on the platform. Really come back and say, what is the outcome that we're shooting for here?
I think that makes sense, and some of these questions might come up again later. So it's kind of nice that we're addressing things here. But let's talk about what can folks do right now. So Sherry, we talked about people being at different stages. If they're ready, what's the first step they should be taking coming out of this webinar?
Well, we've talked about the assessment, and we've done a few of these now. We've actually labeled it a VMware exit readiness assessment. Sounds fancy. But, to be clear about what that is, it's not a commitment to migrate at all. It's just a structured review of your environment, your workloads, those dependencies. We look at your licensing exposure and your timeline so that we can know where we stand. And we focus on the outcomes. So you should be able, once we're done with that assessment, you can decide whether staying on VMware is what makes sense, whether a migration is practical, and if it is, when, which platform option fits your environment, what risks need to be addressed, what the timeline can look like, and an overall cost comparison. So then, our clients can make a decision with confidence, and maybe that decision is to migrate, maybe it's to renegotiate, maybe it's that hybrid, maybe it's wait and plan for a future refresh, but all of those can be valid outcomes. The point is to be able to make a decision before that pressure kicks in and makes it for you.
No, that makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing that, sharing those next steps. Very thought through. All right, so before we get to the Q&A, and I know that Stephen is collecting things, so I'm going to give him a minute here to get all those collated for us. But I wanted to share an additional offer from IP Consulting that's connected to the broader theme of navigating technology change safely. So many of the same organizations that are evaluating things like modernization of infrastructure are also trying to figure out how to adopt AI responsibly. And the challenge really is very similar. So the technology is moving so quickly that organizations need structure and they need governance, and they just need a practical path forward. And so that's why we created the Navigate AI platform with AI adoption services. So for the attendees that are on this webinar, IPC is going to offer a 2-week free trial of secure AI governance platform access. And it's got over 70 different AI models, and it's all in one place on one platform. So this is not, required to take the next steps, obviously, for VMware. We really haven't talked about it throughout, but I think it's just an opportunity to continue to explore another area where we're helping organizations move from uncertainty to clarity, that governed path forward. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to us after the session and we can get you connected and get you set up. Different, technology challenge, same philosophy, right? That structure, that guidance, and that confidence. So, all right, Stephen, I know you've been collecting questions in the background, and I want to make sure that we get these answered. So if you have a question but you haven't asked it yet, please do. There's still time for you to drop it down into the chat. But with that, I see that I've got a few here, so we'll go ahead and get going. So give me 1 second. Sherry, this first one, I'm going to point to you. The question is, what about compliance requirements? How does migration affect our audit standing?
Ooh, love this question. We do help support many organizations in a compliance place. So for those organizations, we look at things like access control, backup and retention requirements, recovery procedures, documentation, logging, vendor-specific requirements. For those that are undertaking CMMC, things like FIPS encryption and logging are some of the key considerations. And so our goal is to make sure that the new environment supports the same or stronger operational controls that were there with the existing platform.
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate that. Okay, the next question is, what if our VMware contract does not expire for another 2 years? Should we still be doing anything now? I'll take that because I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, and I think that what should you be doing? Exactly what you're already doing. Starting to ask the questions and looking at what the options are that are out there. I would say look at an assessment. Sherry's talked a lot about looking at your environment, and does that technology continue to serve you? What we used yesterday, is it still good going forward? So absolutely. All right, I've got another question. Milton, heads up, I think this one's for you. What happens to our backup tools and security appliances? Do those need to change as well?
That's a great question. When it comes to backup tools, what we've seen the vast majority of customers that are migrating are typically using Veeam. And what's good about that is that it's already supported, supports Hyper-V, also supports Proxmox, so there's no real big change there. And we are also a Cloud Connect Veeam partner, so you can back up into our data center offsite. So it works really well. With other applications, sometimes they stay, sometimes they need to be, adjusted. And so, security appliances and monitoring tools and vendor appliances, we would have to validate those against whatever platform we're recommending. So, we don't assume compatibility. So that's part of the assessment process. We go through that. And, sometimes they need to change, but we'll document that as part of, our whole migration path.
That's amazing. Awesome. That's a great question. All right, I do have another one here. Sherry, I think I'm going to lob this one over to you. This is, how long does the assessment take and what does it cost?
Okay, thank you for that question. All right, well, the timeline depends on a few things, mostly size and complexity of your environment. Most of our smaller clients, I will say the assessment can usually be completed fairly quickly once we have access to the right information, both technical and the necessary subject matter experts. And because our purpose is to give you that clear picture of the renewal exposure, the platform cost, that migration readiness. But back to cost of the assessment, typically we see that an average is about $1,500 with a timeline of 2 weeks. I will say though that we're seeing a surge of requests, so our team availability might need to add to that time, but our clients who have gone through the process have said it's a smaller investment than making a renewal or a migration decision without the data.
No, I agree, and we've seen that where it's the assessment goes really quickly, but it changes kind of what the trajectory is,
Yeah.
longer term. So what I thought I was going to do, like the plan that I had in my mind was I was going to go this way, and then uncovering it and saying, hey, how is this serving you? It kind of changes it. So no, that's awesome. All right, I do have, it looks like one more question here. This one is, we are a smaller organization. Is there a reason to think that we wouldn't be able to handle a migration like this on our own? Sherry, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, thank you. I love this question. I would say it's not the number of employees, it's just the complexity of the environment and the number of other initiatives that the IT team is already juggling. We talked about that law firm, that zero capacity, right? So a smaller organization with very straightforward dependencies can often move very successfully. Why IPC you asked that earlier, this is where we can genuinely offer some, I think, unique options because we're a different kind of partner than many MSPs. We specialize in working with your team, not necessarily taking over. And we thrive in those environments when we can augment the true needs. Yes, it can absolutely be done, but we can also plug in where we can add the most value.
Yeah, and let me add to what Sherry's saying. Part of what she's talking about is our fully managed versus co-managed support. I think that's really strong. But then, we also do a lot of turnkey projects for our customers. So, we'll work with your team. That's kind of part of that process. Another reason a lot of customers work with us is not only for our technical expertise, but also because of our project management. I think that's a really strong skill set that not a lot of organizations have strong project managers, and we've been brought in by some of our customers just to manage projects for them because we have a very, very strong, coming from Sherry's legacy within the organization, very strong project management team. So so there's a lot of reasons why you would want to work with us, but we'll work with you to the capacity that you need us to.
Thank you for that. All right. We're really here close to the end of our time together. I think I have 1 minute. Sherry, I want to give you 30 seconds for the final word before I wrap it up.
Thank you, Kimberly. Big takeaway from today is simple. You do not have to figure this out alone. You don't have to rush into a decision, but please start early, get that assessment, know your options, understand your risks, and build that plan before the renewal pressure puts a limit on your choices. So whether you decide to migrate, negotiate, stay, you're at least going to be in a stronger position if you make that decision with real data, and we would be happy to help you with that clear path forward.
Well said, Sherry. Thank you, Sherry and Milton, for your time and expertise today. And on behalf of the entire IP consulting team, thank you to everyone who was able to join us. I hope today provided clarity and confidence about what's coming next. And as a follow-up, our team is going to be sending out an email with a link to this webinar recording, as well as a link to a more technical webinar recording covering VMware migration as well. We have our contact information here on the screen, or you're welcome to respond to any of those upcoming emails. We'd like to keep the conversation going, whether it's answering questions or exploring the VMware exit readiness assessment that we talked about. We just want you to know that we're here to help. So again, on behalf of the IP consulting team, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.